Hi everyone, welcome back to this lecture on syllables and syllabification. We might now ask ourselves the question of whether syllabification can be contrastive. So in this course, from the very beginning, we've talked a great deal about the notion of contrast. This was essential to discovering the idea of phonemes in the first place. That is, if two sounds occur in the same context and they can distinguish the meaning of a word, then we can classify them as contrastive sounds. Syllabification, on the other hand, is interesting in that it appears to be very, very rare for languages to have minimal pairs that are distinguished solely on the basis of syllabification. So it almost doesn't exist to find a language here with two invented forms in which we would have a minimal pair a, ma, so two syllables, one a without an onset or a coda, the second one ma, and versus another word with a coda and a following syllable a. In that case, you can hear actually I'm providing a glottal stop onset to that following to these syllables usually, since that's part of my usual English phonology. Instead, what appears to be the case is that syllabification is purely predictable and therefore not phonemic within a language. In other words, we can say that given a sequence of segments next to each other, we can usually predict how those segments are going to group themselves into syllables. We don't need to know any other information about the word. So this indicates that if we can predict how segments are going to be grouped into syllables, it suggests that, among other things, a language has rules for syllabification. And when we look cross-linguistically, it appears that indeed some aspects of the rules for syllabification are universal. That is, they apply in virtually all human languages. Now, these rules that I'm going to talk about, syllable assignment, onset formation, and coda formation, I'm not going to really formalize them here, but for the moment, I'm just going to describe what the rules do. So we're going to assume then that a syllable is constructed as follows. So first, all plus syllabic segments in a sequence of segments are identified, and those are made into the nucleus of a syllable. So there we provide the beginnings of a syllable. The second step is to form onsets, to add onsets. And here we will join any consonants that are not already part of a syllable. So we could have, of course, some consonants that are plus syllabic and which are made into syllable nuclei. So we'll look for any of those segments, and we'll look for any consonants that come immediately before a syllable nucleus, and we'll attach it to that syllable, provided that the result is a legal or allowed or permissible onset. So later on, we will talk about exactly what legal, allowed, permissible onsets and codas may be. Those are definitely language specific. And this, the segments are attached into an onset until it's no longer possible to make a legal onset. So we can see here in the English examples of syllabification that we saw above that quite sometimes several segments could be grouped together. So if we assume here that we began building this syllable corresponding to the word straw around this plus syllabic segment, all, that then consonants continued to be attached to this syllable until there were simply no consonants left. And all of the consonants were allowed to be attached because the sequence stra is a permissible onset in English. Now, as I said here, the definition of what a legal onset and allowed onset is varies language by language. Usually, it's possible to say what onsets are allowed in a language by looking at the consonants that occur at the beginning of a word. So this process is sometimes referred to as the decomposition theorem. And the decomposition theorem hypothesizes that if a sequence of consonants is allowed at the beginning of a word, then it is a permissible onset. Now, I can already qualify this by saying that the decomposition theorem here is not universally true. Sometimes languages allow sequences of consonants at the beginning of the word that in the middle of the word would not be a well-formed onset. But for the moment, sometimes it's a good first guide to trying to establish what the permissible onsets of a language are. Second is that some languages don't join as many consonants to each syllable as possible at this step. Sometimes they just join one and then stop. In a way, that's like saying that languages, for instance, if they prefer to maintain simple onsets, they may stop. We'd say that such languages then do not obey the onset maximization principle. And usually there's some interaction here between the segments that are put into an onset and sonority. So very often, very many languages will build onsets. Say if we have a sequence of, let's see, we have the following sequence in a language, inti. If we build a syllable here around this E, this second E, then we have two consonants to its left. Very many languages will see that here there is a rise in sonority between the N and the T going from right to left, or conversely, there's a fall in sonority going from left to right. And they will tend to not want to put both of these segments into an onset. This is because there is the general idea that onsets usually prefer to rise in sonority. So if an onset would have falling sonority, maybe then the two segments will not be put into the same onset. Okay, but regardless of how those complexities are worked out and vary cross-linguistically in terms of deciding exactly which segments to place into the onset, then finally the last step will be coda formation. That is, take any remaining segments that have not already been placed into made into a nucleus or placed in an onset and add those to the coda of a syllable. So let's try with an example here of the English word trampoline. So my intuition, we can work with my English intuitions here, is that we have, let's see how well I can draw this. We have 3 syllables. I'll draw some lines here to indicate where I think these syllable boundaries are. So trampoline, trampoline. And so at the level, we would have the level of the word divided into 3 syllables. 1, 2, 3. And we can identify here each of these syllables by each of the plus syllabic segments that occur on the surface, the vowels a, schwa, and e. So when we start to try to build up these syllables, the syllable will be built up by first identifying the nucleus. So here we have a syllable E, sorry, a syllable nucleus E. Here we'll have a syllable nucleus schwa. And here we will have a syllable nucleus a. Not drawn incredibly well there, but I think you can more or less see the idea. Now, in terms of onset formation, let's begin from the first syllable here. So there are 2 consonants to the right of the, there are 2 consonants to the, sorry, the left of the vowel a here, drawn quite badly. And the onset tra is a permissible onset in English. So both of those consonants, both the ra and the ta, can be added to that syllable. So that's finished. Now this syllable built around the schwa, we'll try to build a syllable. Pa is an acceptable onset, perfectly fine. Then if it continues to look to the left, it sees pa is not a permissible onset of English. We haven't said anything about how or why the sequence pa is not allowed as an onset in English, but we can't do that. So this syllable will stop trying to add more consonants. Around the vowel E, it looks to its left and it finds the consonant la, a lateral approximant, that's fine, and there are no more consonants to its left, so it stops. Now at this point, the only remaining unsyllabified consonants are the nasal at the end of the word and the nasal here occurring between the vowel a and this in the onset of the second syllable. So this labial nasal will be added to the coda of that syllable, and the coronal nasal at the end of the word will be added to the coda of the following syllable. Okay, so let's go a bit, let's proceed a bit farther, and we'll try the syllabification of 3 more English words here: stringiest, academy, and coefficient. So notice in this first word, we'll want to begin by identifying the plus syllabic segments. So we have the vowels I, E, and schwa. So the first word will begin by forming in stringiest. We will build 3 syllables corresponding to those 3 plus syllabic segments that we found: I, E, and the schwa, All right. So now that we've conducted nucleus, we've built syllables based on plus syllabic segments, we can proceed to onset formation. So proceeding from left to right here, first we'll look to the left of the vowel I, and there it sees a sequence R, T, S, looking back, and the onset stra is a permissible onset in English, so all 3 of those segments can be directly added to this syllable to build the onset stra. Then at this point we have a syllable stri. We come to the next part, and now this syllable, starting from this E, finds a consonant ga, and that can be part of an onset. But when it goes 1 consonant further to the velar nasal then it would arrive to a sequence ga, which is not a permissible onset in English. Notice we can compare these two. There's a common feature here. It thus looks like, in general, onsets of the form nasal plus stop are not allowed in English phonology. So an onset consisting of a sequence of a nasal plus a stop can't happen. So in this second syllable, only the ga will be added to the onset. And here, starting from the schwa here, there are no consonants to its left, no unsyllabified material to its left. There's immediately another syllable nucleus. So this syllable receives no onset whatsoever. And then finally, all remaining segments are simply added to the codas. So this nasal, this velar nasal that couldn't be syllabified previously is added, and the consonants s and t at the right edge of the word are added to the coda of the following syllable, unless we arrive to the 3 syllables string, est. And I think for some speakers, there might also apply some deletion of this nasal, of this velar stop here. Ignore that. Okay, let's close the drawing panel, and I'll quickly show the syllabifications of the words academy and coefficient here as follows, typing them in over here. So in academy, we again have 3 plus syllabic segments to start. So each of those will build a syllable nucleus. Looking to the left of the first syllable nucleus, that schwa, there is no consonant, so there are no onsets there. To the left of the vowel a, there's a stop, that becomes part of an onset. To the left of this schwa, there's a da, and that becomes part of an onset. Oh, I've forgotten the last vowel here. That's going to be, and to the left of this last vowel, e, there is also a consonant. So this word will then have a fairly simple structure in which each syllable, there are no complex onsets or complex codas. The first syllable lacks any onset or coda whatsoever. The second syllable and each of the following syllables has an onset, but no coda. And finally, the last word is a bit more complicated in the sense that we see here, there is a syllabic consonant, a syllabic nasal in the final syllable. So in the first construction of syllables here, we'll identify the following plus syllabic segments: the vowel O, a schwa, a vowel I, and a plus syllabic nasal right here. So we've got quite a lot here. Let's add the vowel O. So we'll begin with the following syllable nuclei: O, A, I, and N. Then to add onset, in applying onset formation as defined up here, let's clear these drawings. In applying onset formation now, we'll find a few onset consonants here. There's a velar stop to the left of the O. There's no other unslabified segment to the left of this schwa. There's a labiodental fricative to the left of the I, and a palato-alveolar sibilant fricative to the left of the nasal. Then finally, the only remaining unslabified segment is this voiceless alveolar stop at the end of the word, and that will be added to the coda of that following syllable. So here we have the syllabization coefficient. All right. Now, as a further illustration of these rules, let's imagine some possible syllabifications of the following words, which could depend upon what exactly allowable or permissible onsets in the language are. So beginning with this underlying sequence, vowel. So wherever we see a plus syllabic segment, that will of course correspond to the nucleus of a syllable. So there must be a syllable corresponding to A and a corresponding to O. Since there is that F at the beginning of the word preceding this nucleus, the only place this F can go is in the onset of the first syllable. And similarly, the L at the end of the word, the only place where it can fit is in the new coda of the following syllable. So cross-linguistically, insofar as all of these segments are maintained and not deleted or changed in some way, depending upon their position in the syllable, we'll talk about such processes later, this would be the only possible syllabification cross-linguistically. Theoretically, a language could also move the segments around, but ignoring those possibilities, this is the there's only one possibility. In the word iklu, here there will be two options depending upon whether the sequence kla can be treated as a complex onset. Can be treated as a complex onset or not. Theoretically, there are, in fact, three possibilities. So, of course, we're going to have two syllable nuclei built around the vowels I and U. One possibility would be that the language only allows a simple onset la, meaning that the velar stop here has to fit into the coda of one syllable. A further possibility is that during the process of onset formation, applying before coda formation, of course, that both the lateral approximant and the velar stop are put into the onset of the syllable. There is theoretically the other possibility that the language doesn't allow an onset at all in that second syllable, and as a result, both of the consonants are put into the coda. We'll talk about just in a minute why. So these are two fine possibilities which cross-linguistically we're likely to encounter, but this third option is very unlikely to be found cross-linguistically. Now, in the final case, we have 3 consonants occurring between 2 syllable nuclei. So there are, again, 2 vowels, O and A. The consonant at the beginning of the word can't fit anywhere except in the onset of the first syllable. When it comes to these 3 consonants, there are then, of course, many possibilities. One possibility could be that an onset is formed with 2 consonants and leaving 1 consonant in the is then put in the nucleus of the syllable to the left. We could instead see a possibility in which only the ra can occur in the onset of this syllable, leaving the nasal and the labial stop initially unslabified, and then those are placed in the coda of that syllable. Or the remaining options would be for all the consonants to be placed in either the onset or the coda. And again, cross-linguistically, these possibilities in which all of the segments are placed into the onset or the coda of one syllable and are rather unlikely. So cross-linguistically, the first 2 options would be fine, whereas the second 2 options, the third option is uncommon, we might say, and the last option is very unlikely. It's unlikely you'll ever see a language that would decide to place all 3 of these consonants into the coda of a syllable and leave the following syllable without any onset whatsoever. So let's talk a little bit more now. We've seen that since there are different possibilities in terms of which consonants may be placed into an onset or a coda, let's talk a little bit more about some of these cross-linguistic differences. So for instance, similar sequences can have different structures in different languages. So let's take the Spanish word copia, which here has a complex onset in the second syllable, but no coda in the first syllable. This word has been borrowed into the Philippine language Tagalog, in which instead we have the Slavishan kopya, in which there is the pa occurs in the coda of the first syllable, and the onset of the following syllable has only 1 consonant. Now the question is how can we tell that the slabification is different here? It's not the case that the words really sound different at all. Syllables don't really have any phonetic acoustic correlate whatsoever. It's not possible to really hear syllable boundaries, and indeed sometimes native speakers, if you ask some native speakers where they think the divisions are in a syllable, you may get different answers. Of course, I think it's a bit silly to try to get native speakers to identify where syllable boundaries are, because native speakers also don't have intuitions about what the underlying form of a word is or what the rule orderings are. They have this innate phonological knowledge that works together and is applied, but when we try to ask for phonological information that we, as the phonologists trying to analyze the language, are trying to find, when we try to ask for that information directly, the answers that we obtain are debatable at best. So instead, we have to look at how the words actually behave, how the sounds behave, in order to try to determine what the phonological structure is. In this case, the difference between Spanish, the Spanish and Tagalog words copia, we can use other facts about the languages to try to establish what the syllabification of the words must be. So for instance, we know in Spanish that there are no words that end with a labial stop. So we can assume that a labial stop is not an allowed permissible coda in Spanish. Instead, we find in the language that a pa only occurs immediately before a vowel, a glide, or a liquid. And so in those cases, we might assume that it is part of an onset. And we can see that Spanish words do, in fact, occur with the sequence ya. For instance, words like piadoso, pious. So this would lead us to the conclusion that ya is probably a permissible onset. And moreover, the pronunciation of the glide here gives us some very important information, because when an underlying palatal glide, yeah, in Spanish, occurs at the alone in a syllable onset, it tends to be made into a more strongly articulated sound, yeah. And therefore, the fact that this doesn't occur in the word copia tells us that it's probably not, this underlying glide is probably not at the very beginning of the syllable. In Tagalog, on the other hand, there are lots of words that end in a voiceless labial stop, so must then be a possible coda. And without going into any detail here, we can see that the stress rules of Tagalog that put the primary stress on the first syllable here indicate that when a suffix is added, the stress rules are treating the first syllable as though it has a coda. If this word didn't have a coda, we might expect the stress to fall on the second syllable instead. Now, some speakers of Tagalog are able to pronounce words with an onset, pia, like pianista and pianza. Those are allowed words of Tagalog that seem to have complex onsets at the beginning of the word. So Tagalog has allowed onsets, but it prefers, it seems, to maintain simple onsets and put another consonant in a coda instead. So this means that Tagalog is not obeying the onset maximization principle in sequences, yeah, that sort, whereas Spanish is obeying the onset maximization principle. All right, when we come back, we'll begin to talk then about the cognitive reality of syllables. How do we know that such things as syllables actually exist?